So this session is to talk about the Scottish Procurement Climate Forum, and that's been tasked with instigating a step change, focusing on what we buy and how much we buy, as well as how we buy, in order to meet government targets and aspirations to tackle climate change. And Angus Warren has joined us to provide an update of the activity of the forum. Angus is the Chief Executive of Advanced Procurement for Universities and Colleges, and he has been since 2009. But before that, he was the Commercial Director at City University London. And before that, for almost 7 years, he worked for Unilever PLC in various roles. So he's done lots of procurement roles, as you can see. But knowing Angus personally, I would say he's one of the most passionate people I know in relation to this agenda. So he's the ideal speaker to be talking to us today. And I'll just hand over to you, Angus, if that's okay.
Yep. Thank you very much, Julie. Really kind introduction. I've got some slides today, so I'll just put them up now and hopefully you'll be able to see them. Okay, so what I'm planning to do is talk through a bit of information, talk about the background, and then talk about what it is and what it's doing really, the Scottish Climate and Procurement Forum. Sometimes it's called Procurement and Climate Forum, so you'll see it described both ways. It was originally, I think, called Procurement and Climate Forum, but the formal name I think now we're to use as a Climate and Procurement Forum. I don't think it makes much difference either way, but you'll just see it referred to both ways, so they are one and the same, just to avoid confusion. So just by way of background, I'm the co-chair of the forum, the main forum, and as you'll see later on, I also chair and lead on one of the work streams within the forum's activity. But I'll talk about that as I go through. The background, I won't go through all the slides, but hopefully you can see there's been various parts of legislation over the last sort of 10 to 12 years around reporting of climate activity and climate objectives, and some of them relate to procurement. The most recent being the update to the Climate Change Reporting Requirements Amendment Order in 2020, which then made it a statutory requirement to report on targets for reducing emissions in the supply chain. So that'll be integrated into reporting going forward in a bit more detail. The aim, or what's set out in the reporting duties, is to align the spending plans and use of resources to reduce emissions, to use that weight of spend, but also to ensure that spend isn't causing more damage to the climate than can be avoided. And obviously, again, I'm not going to go through read through all my slides, but the key bit there is also to contribute increasingly to the Scotland's adaptation programme, which is to deal with the challenges that are already unstoppable around climate change. The sustainable procurement duty does require public bodies to consider the way they can improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of their area. So obviously that's climate very strongly fits into environmental well-being, but it also has an impact on economic and social impacts because of the increasing and broad impacts that climate change is going to bring. And obviously to publish the procurement strategies and annual reports, and within that, climate, as I said, will become a key part going forward, and it'll become a mandatory part of the reporting going forward. And that'll grow over time on what's expected. Just to touch on the targets, for those that aren't familiar with them, so the Scottish Government has set a target for the country to be net zero by 2045 at the latest, ideally earlier. But the key interim targets here are 75% reduction by 2030 and obviously 90% reduction by 2040. So that's the sort of the context in which the group is operating in. So the forum itself was formed in Remembrance Day in November 2019, and it covers all the main sectors, publicly funded sectors in Scotland. So the non-departmental public bodies, central government, local authorities, NHS, and colleges and universities. And it's to work together really across these areas to develop tools, guidance, practical approaches, and share experiences, and to support a green recovery, and to promote one of the key reporting mechanisms for that is going to be to increase the use of circular economies. So that's something that's emerging out of the work. Okay, so the remit of the group, I won't read all this word for word again, but it's to provide the leadership and direction to help influence and empower local action. So again, looking back at the SPPN 1 2021, that focuses quite a lot on the what we buy, how we buy, and how much we buy, and that's key to everything in the way that we think through dealing with the climate challenge in the supply chain. And just to put in context, just so that people understand who might not be familiar with the impact of climate change, in most organisations we're finding that the climate footprint of the whole organisation, out of the total climate footprint, about 65 to 80% of the climate footprint is actually in people's supply chains. So people increasingly look to procurement to lead on finding the solutions for that impact, and if a local authority is going to hit any targets around net zero, then they can't do even if they get everything on site on their organisation's premises zero, it still won't get anywhere close to net zero unless the supply chain's also been addressed. So that's why the supply chain is suddenly becoming into quite sharp focus in this. The second point is obviously to understand and disseminate the basis in which we measure progress. But that's obviously we need to avoid overly complex reporting mechanisms as well, especially in the early days when granular reporting on figures is going to be challenging because measurement is still at an early stage in some areas. We want to champion and encourage quick wins. So we want to focus on the high risk and high opportunity procurements. So that's looking at forward contracting plans and contract management activities. And we'll be using, to enable that, procurement people will I guess, predominantly be looking at historical spend and consumption patterns and see what can be done around that. The group will develop some supporting evidence for some of the activities and objectives it sets out, and it will set up work streams, which we'll talk about. There's 5 currently, but that may change and adapt as time goes forward. The aim is to promote design for reduce, reuse, and recycle. So that's within specifications, implementation of contract management activities. And that will include considerations around emissions, packaging, plastics, and overall consumption. And to commission information and policy and tools and guidance, or to signpost those that already exist, because a lot already exists, to support buyers and helping them gain traction on this agenda. Obviously retaining a balance with what needs to happen with the day job as well, the core commercial aspects of procurement. So that the objectives of both can be delivered. Okay, so the membership of the forum, I won't go through the names, but as you can see, the sectors are represented here, and we have several local authority members in the main forum, and that's a mixture of people from local authorities and also from Scotland Excel. Going through the work streams, then I'll just very quickly talk again. I'll leave I won't go through all the names, but obviously I can see it on screen. But I'll just talk very briefly about the remits. So the remit of the strategy and objectives work stream. So this is a little bit of an overarching work stream, and that's to look at sort of high level cross sector, maybe chief executive level buy-in, but also to direct heads of procurement and directors of procurement within publicly funded bodies as well. It's to keep a close link with the climate emergency and other Scottish Government policies that have an impact on climate. And it's to set out some commitments, sorry, the messages keep coming up, commitments on, to maybe set out some commitments or objectives and climate solutions, the ones that across sector at a very high level, like heat, which is obviously a major consumer of carbon, and fleet. And to provide a link through to the Scottish Leaders Forum and bodies such as COSLA, the Sustainability Network, and also to set national prioritisation activity based on forward plans of both the government, based on legislation, strategy, but also within sectors, the emerging strategies coming out of sectors. The so I'm just trying to get a slide to move ahead. Okay, the next one is the People and Capability Workstream. So this is development of existing tools, sustainable procurement tools and guidance. And it's to mainstream climate emergency and carbon literacy into the roles of procurement people. Now, obviously, that's something that's not always been seen as a key part of a procurement person's role. So that's to develop that going forward and gradually build the knowledge within procurement colleagues across the publicly funded sectors. Provide mentoring and case studies, and as I say, also to provide the training. The first very good piece of training on climate literacy has been launched recently. I'm sure most of you have seen that. If you haven't, I'd recommend having a look at that within the Scottish Government's toolkit within their online solutions. The next work stream is the supply and market engagement. So that's about collating sort of consistent key messages across the sectors. It's to identify where to prioritise supplier engagement in terms of risk and opportunity, and obviously to do things as collectively as possible. To develop consistent wording and tools so that the suppliers, the market doesn't get a whole myriad of maybe 100 different forms to fill in to ask the same, to respond to the same questions. So to drive consistency as much as possible. And also to work through sort of appropriate wording for using in tools such as PCS and Journey and the European Procurement Document, etc. So tools such as that. The operational procurement work stream. So this is messaging and sort of what buyers can do now and plan for. So it's looking at what are the quick wins here. What are the things that we could that are worth working on in the slightly longer term across what we call the primary impact area of climate change, PIACs for short. The brief of the group is also to signpost sources of support and guidance, and also to publish and encourage consistent approaches and support embedding of sort of from now to 2030. We saw earlier as a key objective for 2030 to maximise the progress by that date, and I'll talk about that in a bit more in a moment as well, through the creation of tools and guidance from this group. And the final group is in some ways the most challenging one. It's about monitoring and reporting. So it's about encouraging appropriate use of life cycle costing, whole life costing, which obviously has always been a key part of procurement activity, but to think more widely and more holistically, including climate. Development of practical approaches for of measuring and reporting of climate progress across public procurers, and is to look at what's out there at the moment around tools and methodologies that can enable us to report in a consistent way moving forward. Although this is a group that's going to do, I think, a lot more research work before there's major outcomes in relation to specific reporting on detailed figures. So for obvious reasons. So you might not be able to read this. The Climate and Procurement Forum publishes a 2-slide update for use for cascading on what it's doing. So just to pick up some highlights, really, in the next, the strategy and objectives work stream currently are working on a high-level roadmap and developing a process for tracking strategies and reporting by public bodies. Into next year, there will also be looking at the new, later this year and moving towards next year, be looking at the new climate PSIP questions and wider stakeholder engagement as well. The operational procurement work stream is just completing the development of a from now to 2030 category planning template, which should be ready for publication in the next few days. The final version was agreed on the 26th of May. So that'll be published, and that will enable a tool to map, allow public bodies to map where they're going in relation to climate over the next 10 years to try and make the plan being to start with where you want to get to as ideally a net zero point or close to it as possible, and work back and what the plans need to be. And that's quite a challenging piece of work. But having a simple tool to help with that, and also to integrate it into reporting going forward, was felt across all the sectors to be a really useful solution. And there's some early examples of that we'll be produced in the next couple of weeks. One's already been done. The first has already been completed by City of Glasgow College. But there's going to be samples from various sources that'll be distributed across sectors to show and across a different range of categories, to help guide people in how they could go about setting up their own. There'll then be, later on in this work stream, there'll be an initial batch of PIAC guides, cross-sector guides to talk about what are the short-term, long-term, and some signposting of things you can do by category or commodity group. The monitoring and reporting work stream, they're working currently on a gap analysis of the tools and methodologies available, and they'll continue that, I think, into towards the end of the year and into next year. The supplier and market engagement work stream, they're presenting at the Meet the Buyer event, which I believe is this week, to raise awareness of the climate emergency among the supplier community. They're also working on some templates at the moment and some initial dialogue with the supply market. And they're also developing wording for use with suppliers, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, in relation to the tools that we use. People and capability work stream, they continue to promote the climate literacy training and review and update that training, and also other training in relation to sustainability, particularly focused on climate. And moving into next year, they'll continue to analyse the needs and develop sort of shared solutions as appropriate going forward. So key messages really, and this is about what do we need to do as a procurement community. So really it's to sort of prioritise and mobilise around dealing with the climate emergency and the challenges presented by the fact that most of it is in our supply chains. So what we suggest really is some early pointers. Start working on prioritisation, use the Scottish Government prioritisation tool and any other local available information and tools that you have as well. The more, the better. Look at your primary impact areas of climate change, and that will vary organisation to organisation and sector to sector. But the actual impact areas, where the areas where there's high environmental impact, are often obvious. So don't wait till you have detailed emission data to start acting, because it will be too late if we do that, because we really need to get the actions well underway before we have the data, the detailed data on specific pieces of equipment, etc. Look out for the tools and materials that come out of our work streams on the forum. Over the coming months, each work stream will be generating some outputs. Ideally, it's going to be developed, as to be as simple as possible. So there'll be a suite of hopefully quite brief tools that will be easy to use and understand. And the template for the category planning template is the next one due out in the coming days. So I'll be distributed across each sector within by each sector. Early reporting, because of what we mentioned around data on emissions, etc., and how to calculate them in a consistent way, early reporting will likely be narrative on actions that you're taking place, and that's absolutely fine. Don't feel that the reporting is in some way substandard at this stage because you don't have detailed carbon and other emissions figures, reporting on the actions and plans is important at this stage. And work with your key stakeholders in partnership. We can't do this on our own. This needs to be something that's done with the people who are the end users of services and goods. And we need to work with them to set objectives and put long-term plans in place, and encourage them to work with our supply base to deliver that as well. And if you feel you need to learn a bit more about climate literacy, please do use the online training. There's actually a link in this slide, but I won't go into it because you need to log in, etc. But that's quite easy to access, and everybody can access that and do the online training. So really quite a useful piece of training material there. The themes sort of to focus on from a key message perspective. So one is obviously demand management, so reducing and modifying demand. So previously in supply chain, those that have been around for a long time, the holy grail was always just in time. Unfortunately, just in time is one of the things that are causing the biggest problems for climate change, because of additional deliveries, because of smaller deliveries, because of a supply chain that has to be reactive, which actually by definition has been found to be higher in carbon. So that's a real challenge for us, because just in time has now been built into a lot of the way we do things and we store things. The next area, the next sort of theme to sort of think about then is to stop fulfilling the need completely, to stop buying it. Can we phase out what we're doing? Could we change business processes so we don't buy these goods or services anymore? Can we buy lower emission alternatives? Can we reduce the climate impact through reducing waste, including looking at the whole end-to-end supply chain, looking at packaging and whether we can move to returnable packaging, if that can be helpful. There's a lot of carbon associated with the production of the packaging and protection equipment that goes with goods. Reducing the emissions through the design and production stages, so working with suppliers to reduce at the point of design, but also applying all the way through the manufacturing process. One that's been a somewhat obvious one that most people already sort of think of as something that we can do around climate, which is reducing emissions in transportation. And then reducing emissions in use, so looking at the whole life way that people actually use goods and providing maybe support and guidance, again working with end users on how people use things, using equipment for less time, leaving it switched on for less time, having lower power consumption equipment and finding ways to reduce energy consumption, like computing. Obviously, the hotter the room is, the more energy that we'll use to keep the computer cool. Voluntary or enforced switch-offs when not in use of equipment and systems, and built-in environmental settings. And then obviously the use of the circular economy, which is key, extending the life of things that we already buy to make them last. So computers, make them life, instead of lasting 3-4 years, make them last 8 or 9 or 10 years, things like that. And furniture, reusing and upcycling furniture, or converting to a different purpose at the end of life rather than going into waste streams. And the key bit really is to start work earlier. So this is a slide from Professor Alice Larkin from the Tyndall Centre at the University of Manchester, but it highlights the real benefit in starting early. One is that it's a more gentler approach. The longer you leave it, the more dramatic activity you have to go through to deliver change. But it also means that the earlier you start, you can actually work with not hitting net zero till later, and you still have a lower footprint. Obviously, the climate emissions are building all the time, and it's not something that gets wiped clean every year and you start again. It's all been accumulated. So that the earlier we can start, then the more gentle approach you can take to dealing with it. So that's the key message really, is start as soon as possible wherever you can, rather than putting things off. And that was it. So hopefully that's been a useful sort of introduction. I think there's a little bit of time for questions at the end. I thought I would just leave until the end rather than go through them as we went along. So hopefully that's okay if anyone's got any.
Yep. Okay, so thanks, Angus. That was really interesting to hear about the work that you're doing. I'm going to kick off. I've actually got a question for you, and as you would expect, it's a difficult one, and it's just more to prompt conversation. So, with the raft of sort of policy priorities that are already being delivered by procurement teams, how do we make climate change a priority, do you think?
I think it will depend on what level of support we get from senior stakeholders within organisations. We'd ideally want the support from chief executives and senior elected members within the local authority sector to be able to support the activity and the work that procurement people are doing. Because as I say, we can't do this on our own, and we need it to come from both the top and bottom to get progress. It is a real imperative, and I think the more people understand about the impacts of climate change, the more they'll be willing to engage. I think it is something that it doesn't have an ability to be put back by sort of 2 years or 5 years, because that will just make the situation worse when it does come, and the impacts obviously will be far greater then. Yeah.
Okay, you've actually got another couple of questions in the chat. I'll just read them out for you, Angus. So you've got a question from Les Robertson. If we need to make a difference in our supply chain of 60%, how do we quantify the additional cost that this may bring from these suppliers in assisting us meeting these targets? I think it would be good if we can quantify any such additional costs associated with climate for reporting purposes. This is in addition to the need to properly resource the additional internal resource to carry out these tasks. And then in brackets, climate sustainable procurement is only one policy area requiring changes within procurement. What are your thoughts on that? It's quite a lot, Angus.
Yeah. Well, I think that within the weightings for when we're doing tendering, I think we need to build climate in as one of the factors alongside price. That's pretty essential. But it's surprising when you look at the detail of the impacts of climate, and it often doesn't increase cost. And if you look at the whole life costing of something, it often reduces cost. And there's a lot of savings can be made from, for example, implementing circular economy. If you're refurbishing a piece of equipment or a piece of furniture rather than buying new, there's a substantial financial saving. So it's not always the case that the most climate friendly option is going to cost more.
Yeah.
And, so really that's
the challenge is you've talked about already. Don't wait until you've got the data, but the challenge is having the data to show that. It's a wee bit chicken and egg, but completely get where you're coming from. You've got another question here. So key messages are great, but what has been the biggest challenge for the forum, and what can this community do to help achieve these important aims?
I would guess the biggest challenge for the forum is probably members of the forum engaging with people across their sectors to try and get buy-in. There was a letter due to go out in December to chief executives. I think it eventually went out in March, and it was hoped it is hoped that will help to drive a greater understanding of the priorities within the forum. But I think getting buy-in and getting, as you say, I mean, the answer to that really is in what you mentioned before. There's so many priorities. I mean, procurement, we're expected to do everything. We're expected to deliver on every policy for virtually all the public bodies and the Scottish Government. So everything apparently can be done through procurement. But this genuinely is one area where the buck does land with us, because so much of it is in the supply chain. So that's something that's going to be unavoidable from our perspective. So it does really fall into our camp. So the sooner we grab it, the better.
So you've got another couple of questions. We're running slightly over. Are you okay still to answer another couple of questions, Angus?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
So we've got a question here from Stuart Calderwood, and what he's asking is whether net zero is best addressed as part of the core requirement in the specification, or added value, i.e. sustainable procurement due to community benefits, or a combination. Quite a technical question there, Angus. What are your thoughts?
I think it's best. Yeah, I think it's best integrated into the core requirement wherever possible. And because because it's in legislation, that allows us to build it into the specification, not just have it as a nice to have. It can be built in and scored on because it's part of complying with legislation.
Okay. And the final question that I'll give you is from Veronica Formosa Hamilton. And she's thanked you for the presentation, but with requests to whole life costing exercises, will this come as part of the extended producer responsibility legislation on packaging? The consultation on packaging EPR closes today. Has Scottish Procurement or Scotland Excel provided a response on this? And is there work with Zero Waste Scotland on extending the carbon metric?
I can only say that ideally that would be included within that, but it's too early to say. I obviously don't work for the government policy team, but we'd be very strongly advocating that it's built into that. Yeah.
Well, Veronica, we'll try and get an answer to that, and you've asked from our perspective as well, and I'm not sure is the answer, but we'll take that offline and try and get you an answer. And the good news is we've got Ian Gilland from Zero Waste Scotland joining us in the next section, so hopefully you're joining us too, and maybe we can put that question to him in relation to the carbon metric. And with that, I would like to thank Angus for taking the time out to join us. We really appreciate you sharing the good work that you're doing with the wider team. Our next session for climate emergency and sustainability is setting out Scotland's roadmap to recovery and recycling our way to a more sustainable future, and that will run from 11 o'clock to 11:30. And we really hope to see you all there when we're joined by Ian Gulland from Zero Waste Scotland. And with that, we'll close the session. Thanks again, Angus.